Good morning and good evening. Today we have Professor Thomas Khurana from University of Potsdam. Thomas Khurana is Professor of Philosophical Anthropology and Philosophy of Mind at the University of Potsdam. His research concerns issues in social and political philosophy, philosophy of mind, philosophical anthropology, and aesthetics. It draws on various traditions of post-Kantian European philosophy, especially German idealism, critical theory, and 20th century continental thought. Currently, Professor Khurana works on a critical theory on second nature, a rearticulation of the sociality of human life form, and develops the philosophical implication of the Anthropocene. So I give the word to Professor Khurana, please.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction and for the kind invitation. I'm very happy to be here. If only this is virtually, but that makes it much easier. So very pleased and delighted to meet all of you, and very much looking forward to the discussion. So I circulated a paper. This paper is unpublished, but I thought it would be helpful for you to have it in advance. I'm hoping I won't bore you because I will pretty much just read out the paper and maybe give some oral comments. But hopefully this is for the interest of all, so that we have a common shared basis for our discussion. Yeah, I should say right away, if you have looked at the paper, I won't read out section 3, just in order to save some time so that we have more time for discussion. But I think that the core idea that I want to formulate is already present in the first two steps. So the paper or the project or the talk that I'm going to present is part of a larger project on the notion and the problem of Gattungswesen, or Genus-Being, as I like to translate it. The idea that human beings are species beings, or as I would propose to translate it, Genus-Beings, is familiar to all of you, I think, as developed by the early Marx. However, what exactly means that we are Gattungswesen, Genus-Beings, species beings, is a difficult question. In my view, a crucial point is that to characterize us as Genus-Beings or Gattungswesen precisely does not mean to characterize us as species beings or Artwesen. That's why I'm avoiding this translation. It does not involve tying us to a given form of life that serves as our pre-established normative standard, nor does it necessarily imply a speciesist elevation of the human being above other species. Being a genus being rather means a special form of self-relation, a special relation to the surrounding nature, and a peculiar form of sociality to which humans in some specific way go beyond the determination through their given species and constitute themselves as self-conscious and free beings. In other works, I have attempted to trace how the articulation of these ideas was developed from Hegel to Marx. Today, I want to trace the idea of the genus being or Gattungswesen back to an author who many would not consider as a promising candidate, I think, in this regard, namely Kant. Kant himself does not use the term Gattungswesen, nor does the idea of Gattung in general feature prominently in his writing. So that's why it's quite understandable if you wouldn't assume he would be a probable candidate. Nevertheless, I find Kant's work particularly instructive in one respect, namely in terms of the way in which our existence as genus beings manifests itself in our capacity for aesthetic experience and the production of art. Marx does point us to the aesthetic dimension of the genus being, but does not develop it in any detail. In the Paris Manuscripts, Marx writes in this sense, in a very interesting passage, that our genus character, our Gattungscharakter, which distinguishes us from other animals, is revealed in our ability to produce not only according to the laws of our own species, but according to the laws of every species, and even according to the laws of beauty. The emphasis on beauty as a specifically human characteristic is reminiscent of Kant's characterization of humans in the Third Critique. Here Kant writes that access to beauty distinguishes humans from animals on the one hand and pure rational beings on the other hand. And I quote Kant from the Third Critique: agreeableness das Angenehme, agreeableness is also valid for non-rational animals. Beauty is valid only for human beings, i.e. animal, but also rational beings, tierische, aber doch vernünftige Wesen. But not merely as the latter, for example, spirits, rather as beings who are at the same time animal. So he says, we have access to the good, rational, other rational creatures, those that don't have sensibility too. Non-rational animals have access to the agreeable, but beauty is only for humans. Yeah, this kind of specific relation to the world that we have in when we perceive it as beautiful is something that only animal, yet also rational, yet at the same time rational creatures can have. Marx and Kant thus agree that a decisive distinguishing feature of humans lies in their access to beauty. Returning to Kant, we can see more clearly the extent to which aesthetics exposes a self-relation, a relation to nature, and a relation to others that prefigure the self-relation, the relation to nature, and the sociality of genus beings. I will proceed in 3 steps, but as I said, only read out the first 2. First, I will briefly remind you of Marx's concept of Gattungswesen and outline the role the aesthetic plays in Marx's conception. Second, I will trace the extent to which the aesthetic dimension of the genus being can be further developed by drawing on the definition of aesthetic experience from the third critique. As we will see, Kant's elaboration of the aesthetic realm allows us to characterize more precisely the self-relation, the relation to nature, and the relation to others that characterizes the genus being. In the third step, which I won't read out, I would try to outline, or in the written paper, I try to outline how Kant's conception of the production of beautiful art can serve to illuminate the ways in which we can truly realize ourselves as genus beings through a specific mode of productive activity. I will then conclude with a brief summary of the achievements and limitations of Kant's aesthetic investigations of the genus being. So let me start with the first step. Marx developed the concept of genus being, a concept used before him by Feuerbach and used at the same time by Moses Hess, in his early Paris Manuscripts in the context of his analysis of alienation. The capitalist conditions he seeks to analyze and criticize are characterized by the fact that we are alienated from our genus being. This does not mean that we had previously realized ourselves as genus beings, Gattungswesen, and had become alienated from this through a mere historical accident. So you could think that, so that Marx has a conception of what it would be to be a genus being. We once were those beings, then capitalism came around, and then we stopped being those genus beings, or were alienated from our genus being. But what he rather suggests is that we begin to realize ourselves as genus beings at first in an alienated form. Yeah? So that's, I think, important to note. But what does it mean to be a genus being? Let's turn to the passage in which Marx introduces the very concept. I read this passage from the Paris Manuscript. The human being is a genus being, not only because in practice and in theory it turns the genus into its object, its own genus, as well as the genus of other things, but, and this is only another way of expressing it, also because it relates to itself as the actual living genus, because it relates to itself as a universal and therefore a free being. A Gattungswesen is therefore a being that does not simply belong to a Gattung, or fall under it, but explicitly refers to its Gattung in its theoretical and practical consciousness. It belongs to its genus by knowing itself to be a member of its genus and practically determining it through its actions. While animals also lead a genus life, Gattungsleben, as Marx puts it, according to Marx, operating in their theoretical and practical relation to the world as a specimen of their species, humans are characterized by theoretical and practical genus consciousness. So animals have genus life, we have genus consciousness. An explicit, that means an explicit and conscious relation in which we make our own genus character the object of our knowledge and action. Through this conscious relation, the general to which they refer, genus beings refer, is transformed from the limited and abstracted form of a species, to which one belongs or under which one falls, into the concrete and living form of universality that Marx and also Hegel calls genus. This conscious relation thus turns them into universal and free beings. Their freedom depends on their operating in a particular way. A genus being does not blindly realize the generality that is predetermined and prescribed for it, like the form of its species, is given to a specimen of that species. Rather, the genus being becomes the very source of its own doing by self-consciously determining the generality it brings itself under. As a genus being, I do not subordinate myself to a given species. I relate to myself as the present living genus. In this sense, being a genus being describes first and foremost a specific kind of self-relation. Now, one might think that this is simply an idealistic commonplace or platitude. However, two things must be taken into account. First, the inner connection between life and self-consciousness that inflects this self-relation. And second, the fact that this self-relation is simultaneously linked to a particular relation to external nature and a specific type of sociality. Regarding the first point, the self-relation that I have highlighted is not an abstract intellectual self-relation that exists alongside our natural existence, but is itself the mode of realization of our natural existence. So if you think back on the quotation I gave you from Kant, where Kant says, "So beauty distinguishes us as animal yet rational beings, but not just rational beings purely, so not just as spirits, but as rational beings that also are sensible beings." You see here that that the concept of a genus being is such a conception. It's a conception of a self-conscious living being. So it's not the fact that we are living beings that belong to a species, and separate from this, we have an existence as rational beings, i.e., genus beings, but it is a certain mode in which we are natural beings that gives us this other character. Yeah. So in Hegel's word, we could say we are general thinking animals, and animals should be underlined. In Marx's words, we could say I relate to myself as the living genus. So we are not on the one hand living animals, and on the other hand self-conscious genus beings, on the one hand natural living beings, and on the other hand rational persons. We are self-conscious living beings or living self-consciousness. We depend on our natural existence and coexistence in order to be self-conscious species beings or genus beings in and through this natural existence. We are genus beings only by grasping and reconstituting our natural life, not against our sensible existence, but through seizing and transforming it. This is also evident in the extent to which being a genus being involves not only a special self-relation, but also a specific relation to the wider natural world and to other genus beings. Right at the beginning of the passage quoted, Marx says that human beings as genus beings make not only their own genus, but also the genus of other things into the object of their theoretical consciousness and practical activity. Human beings, therefore, do not prove themselves to be genus beings in solitary reflection on themselves and in mere opposition to other things. So it doesn't say, so we are genus beings by virtue of the fact that we know our own genus, but disinterested in whatever else might be the case. But by having access to genus as such, in general, whether it might be ours or that of other things. And so we make both our own genus and the genus of other things into the object of theoretical and practical consciousness. Human beings, therefore, do not prove themselves to be genus beings in solitary reflection, but precisely by making the genus character of other things themselves the object of their knowledge. With Hegel on, one can say that the living already is the genus in itself, but not yet for itself. The achievement of the genus being is to bring the generic character already implicit in the living itself to consciousness. It therefore, and that now involves a certain interesting rearticulation of the difference between a genus being and the things it looks upon. The genus being differs from other merely living beings in that it brings something to consciousness and thus to deeper significance, which the genus being shares precisely with those other living beings. So what divides me from other living creatures is the fact that I have access to something that the two of us share, something that the living being cannot see in the same sense. It isn't aware of its own genus in the way I am, and thus it's also not aware of my genus in the same way I am. And so he cannot, or it cannot, see the kind of connection I see between myself and this other thing. But this means a genus being is in the position to acknowledge a stronger kind of connection to other existing things in the world. Marx also expresses our specific connection to the nature that surrounds us in the famous and often problematized formulation that man, through his practical species activity, makes, and I quote, the whole nature into its inorganic body. This is problematic, it is assumed, because it is interpreted as a hyperbolic elevation of humans above nature and a possessive appropriation of it. However, Marx does not say, and we should note that we should make the whole of nature into our organic body. So that means we should not, or he doesn't tell us that we ought to communicate the organic unity of ourselves to nature. We make it our inorganic body, and that's quite something different. We do not stand with nature in the continuous unity of some superorganism. Nevertheless, nature still is our body in a different sense, namely in the sense that we are dependent on it for our existence as genus beings. We are intertwined with the nature that surrounds us in this particular way precisely insofar as we do not simply treat it in a species-typical way as an environment, appropriate it and consume it, but rather allow it to come into its own and at the same time transform it through our own activity. So one general kind of contrast that both Hegel and Marx draw between mere animals and the kind of rational animals that we are is the fact that rational animals or self-conscious animals realize themselves by objectifying themselves in the world. And thus, in order to manifest their own being, their own character, what they are, their own type of universality, they need something outside of themselves in which they can realize themselves. So the process, which is analyzed in terms of the process of labor. But if that's the way in which we realize ourselves, not by taking in material from our environment and digesting it, consuming it, but rather by letting something be as it is, but then transforming it, giving it a different shape, this means that we are dependent on the independent existence of other things in a different way than other living creatures are. The peculiar self, and so therefore he says that's the reason why he would call nature as such as our inorganic body. It's part of the way in which we can objectify ourselves. And this is not the case for mere animal beings. They don't need nature to be that. They don't have the relation to nature as such as their inorganic body. The peculiar self-relation of the genus being implies not only this different relation to the surrounding things, but also an inner relation to other beings of the same genus. The fact that a genus being relates to itself as the present and living genus does not mean that it does not need others to do so, and refers only to itself in splendid isolation. Rather, it can only be the living genus for itself insofar as it is internally related to other members of the genus. Insofar as it is within itself, beyond itself, and necessarily related to other members of the same genus. According to Marx, we are genus beings only insofar as we directly relate to other members of our genus in our theoretical and practical relation to the world. The relation described here does not simply mean that we do the same things side by side and without direct reference to one another, which would allow us to be subsumed under the same class, genus, or species. So it doesn't just mean there are other beings like me that do the same kinds of things. And if I look at it from outside, I could say, well, this is one instance of the same type that I see instantiated here. The relation described here is more demanding. Marx asserts that in our cognition and action, so it's not just we a member of one class, but rather we essentially direct ourselves to others for whom the same is true. I'm not a genus being because I share characteristics with other beings that fall into the same class, genus beings. I'm a genus being because of my irreducible relation to other genus beings, to whom I relate and of whom I am the addressee. So I'm in a second person relation with other genus beings. So that's what constitutes me as a being of this sort. The determination of what constitutes our genus being is therefore dependent on this relation to one another. It is through my relation to others that I'm mediated with my genus being, or true common being, Gemeinwesen, as Marx also puts it. Marx qualifies the self-relation, the relation to nature, and the social relation characteristic of the genus being now in a further way by connecting them to genus being's distinct capacity for beauty. And that's the passage that I want to now look at more closely, and that I want to use Kant in order to elaborate. So let me cite this interesting passage in full, even though it's quite long. Paper 6 is page 6 on the paper if you want to want to read it with me. So the human being proves itself as a genus being, Bewährung des Menschen als eines bewussten Gattungswesens. Through the practical creation of a world of objects, the human beings work upon inorganic nature. Admittedly, animals also produce, Marx says, but an animal only produces what it immediately needs for itself or its young. It produces one-sidedly, while man produces universally. It produces only under the dominion of immediate physical need, whilst man produces even when he is free from physical need, and only truly produces in freedom from it. An animal produces only itself, whilst the human being reproduces the whole of nature. An animal's product belongs immediately to its physical body, whilst the human being freely confronts that product. An animal forms objects only in accordance with the standard and the need of the species to which it belongs, whilst the human being knows how to produce in accordance with the standard of every species, and knows how to apply everywhere the inherent standard to the object. The human being therefore also forms objects in accordance with the laws of beauty. We can leave aside for now the question of whether Marx is correct in his characterization of the animal mode of production, or whether he underestimates it. So it's not that I don't think is the main issue here, or what is important for us. I think I have my doubts whether that's an accurate kind of description of animal behavior. But let us focus on the conceptual distinction he seeks to make. So he describes here the normative openness of the genus being, I think, which is manifested in the fact that genus beings know how to produce not only according to the measure and needs of its own given species, but also according to the measure of every species. I also point you to the fact that he doesn't just say to the measure of all species. So you could think he would mean every species we know we can produce to the standard of all species in the sense that every species known to us. But no, he says every species, which suggests to me that he wants to suggest we have true universality in this regard. So even species we haven't yet encountered, we could produce according to their standard. And thus he suggests that we can't just do that, but we can also produce according to the laws of beauty. And the laws of beauty are laws that are present where there is no given standard of a species. Yeah? So even where that standard is absent, we can produce and find an inherent measure in the object of our doing. Okay, but what does beauty have to do with the ability to measure an object not according to our species-specific needs, but according to its inherent measure, more precisely? I believe that Kant can help us understand what Marx might have in mind here. And so I want to turn to my second step, to the third critique, and see how Kant's account there might help us understand why beauty is such a specific, interesting feature, and why beauty might be the most appropriate way of finding access to the kind of universality that's specific for a genus being and that distinguishes it from a species being. All right, let us recall what characterizes an aesthetic judgment according to Kant's exposition in the third critique. As Kant summarizes at the end of the second moment, beauty is that which pleases universally without a concept. When I judge something to be beautiful, I do not proceed by subsuming it under a given concept and then measuring it against that concept as its given standard in order to arrive at a judgment of how perfectly or imperfectly it fulfills itself. So that's Kant's main point against rationalism, to say judgments of beauty are not judgments of perfection. I don't have a concept and measure whether something lives up to the concept. That's not what I do when I say something is beautiful. Rather, I judge the object in a normatively distinctive way without being given a specific concept or standard. It is noteworthy that the gap opened up by the lack of a determinate concept is not simply filled by the feeling of pleasure or displeasure, or agreeableness or disagreeableness, that marks the experiencing subject due to its species. I do not start from the species of the experiencing subject instead of the concept of the object and determine the object according to whether it is pleasant or unpleasant to the subject on the basis of its given nature. Yeah, we could say, well, the object, I don't have any standard what it is supposed to be, so I can't measure it against it. But I can still say, well, it's pleasurable to me, it's good for me, so that's what takes precedence here. But what judgment of beauty is, it's not dependent on my species-specific needs and sensibilities, and also not even on my private needs and sensibilities. Rather, I measure the individual object in a certain way against itself as a general object, I would say. I experience it in such a way that it, the beautiful thing, as an individual, agrees with itself as a general object. So it agrees with itself with some universal thing or some universal aspect or generality that is present in it. The object as an individual in its uniqueness, the object as an intuition, thus appears universal or in harmony with the universal that is present through this individual itself. I therefore do not measure the object against the given external standard, an object I impose, or a sensibility I as a subject impose. I measure it against an inherent measure derived from its intuition itself. Yeah, so that's why I want to say, when Marx talks about an inherent standard there, or an inherent measure, there's a way in which we can understand Kant's idea of beauty to be about this, about an inherent measure. An obvious objection to this initial attempt at capturing Kant's intuition on aesthetic judgments could be that it cannot really be a matter of inherent measure, since Kant makes it very clear right in his account of the first moment of aesthetic judgments that, and I quote him, nothing at all in the object is designated by aesthetic pleasure. It is, and I continue to quote, the subject merely, in it as the subject merely feels itself as it is affected by the representation, quoted. I think that Kant, I don't deny that Kant says that, so I have to accept that he does, but I think that Kant strongly overemphasizes the subjective character of aesthetic judgment in these passages, in the beginning of his treatise. For when I judge something to be beautiful, I'm not merely asserting that I myself am in a certain state, the mental state of a free play between imagination and understanding, but that the representation of that object demands such a response, that I ought to be in that state. When we engage in a discussion about whether something is beautiful or not, we are not arguing about whether the other person has a certain self-feeling or not, but about whether that person should have such a self-feeling in view of the object. And when we discuss whether this is the case, interestingly, we do not turn inward to consider the general relation between our various faculties, the proportion of our faculties, but outward to the object of our judgment. So if I quarrel with you whether something is beautiful, I don't tell you something about my faculties and how they play with each other. I show you, I point you to features of that object and tell you what's so great about that object, and try to elicit the kind of play of your faculties in you by what I'm telling you that happens in myself. We are therefore arguing about whether this object is such that it should evoke a certain kind of self-feeling in the subject. The dispute over aesthetic judgment does not abstract from the object, but understands the object itself as the true bone of contention. If aesthetic judgment did not touch upon its external object, it would also be very difficult to understand how Kant could arrive at the far-reaching conclusions he tries to draw from aesthetic experience. Namely, the conclusion, for example, that Kant expresses in his famous reflection that beautiful things indicate, I quote, that the human being belongs in the world, so der Mensch passt in die Welt. However subjective as Kant's aesthetic judgments may be, they cannot be subjective in the sense that the judgment is based on A, contingent species specific preferences, B, random particular characteristics of the subject, or C, the arbitrary stipulations on the part of the subject. I do not judge here that the object is pleasing to me because it corresponds to what members of my natural species generally like or dislike. Nor do I judge that it corresponds to my given private taste. And finally, I do not judge that it fulfills an arbitrary standard set by me on a whim. Rather, the idea of the object engages my cognitive faculties in a productive play through which I recognize its intelligibility as such, its capacity to be grasped generally from itself. even in the absence of a concept. And I assume that every other animal, yet rational being, should be engaged in a comparable play by this object. This is not an objective judgment in a technical sense, of course, if an object is the correlate of a conceptually articulated determining judgment of the understanding. But it is an objective judgment in the broader sense that it is directed at the object without interest and that it aims at an intersubjective generality. It determines the object neither on the basis of my accidental, individual, or species-typical nature, nor on the basis of my contingent or rationally necessary purposes, but on the basis of the object's self-relation, which I experience in the medium of my own self-relation, through special feeling of aesthetic pleasure. So when I say, what I say, if I say something is beautiful, is I say the object here has a certain relation to itself. And the way I perceive it is by perceiving a certain or entertaining a certain self-relation, by understanding my faculties to be an indeterminate free play. Yeah? That's my way of perceiving or experiencing a feature of the object, namely the self-agreement of the object. That is a self-agreement without concept. A remarkable feature of aesthetic judgment is the fact that it is situated on the level of sensibility and feeling. In this case, it's not that I disregard my sensible nature and in abstraction from and in opposition to it, establish a relation to the object that lies beyond sensible affection. In order to find something beautiful, I must be affected by it through my senses and adhere to its concrete individual representation in my intuition. I then make my aesthetic judgment about the object, thus represented through a feeling. The feeling of pleasure certainly does not precede my judgment here, but at the same time it is also not merely the external effect of my judgment, but rather my judgment of the object as beautiful is carried out through my particular feeling of pleasure. I judge something to be beautiful through the disinterested pleasure I take in it. So if I say it is beautiful, this is the expression of my judgment. Of course, this is a verbal expression of my judgment, but it's not necessary for me to judge, to say these words. It's necessary for me to have a certain kind of pleasure, a distinct type of pleasure. So the judgment is being made in the mode of a feeling, in the mode of a self-feeling. In the mode of my pleasure, I judge a thing to be thus and so. If I want to judge whether something is agreeable to me or not, I must first experience it so that pleasure precedes my judgment. So in a judgment that something is agreeable, I first encounter it, I feel it in a certain manner, and then I come to the conclusion that's agreeable to me through my experience, which is the basis of that judgment. When I judge whether something is morally good, this judgment is based on reason, and the practical pleasure in the good is merely an effect of the rational determination, so what Kant calls praktische Lust. When I judge something to be beautiful, however, I do so through the specific disinterested pleasure I experience in it. So there's a way in which judgment and pleasure coincide here. Aesthetic experience shows that I possess a sensibility that transcends animal sensibility. I possess a sensibility that is not solely predetermined by the given species-specific or individual nature of my needs and sensitivities, but which can freely determine itself in relation to the understanding, and is thus capable of engaging in aesthetic judgments. If it is correct to assume that Kant, in his definition of the aesthetic, is tracing the peculiarity of the genus being, then he obviously does so by attributing to it a special sensibility that is capable of entering into a free relation with its understanding. At the same time, he suggests that I can attain a certain form of generality that does not subordinate the natural, but rather elevates it to general and open cognizability, precisely through a judgment that takes place on the level of such free pleasure. You will recall that Marx speaks of the genus being relating to itself as the living genus, thereby relating to itself as a universal and free being. It is precisely in this regard that Kant specifies that the universality and freedom at stake here are not exhausted by the free dominion or domination of understanding and reason over nature, which I can subsume under my concepts or use as a means to practical ends. Rather, the genus being is characterized by an aesthetic freedom that goes beyond this. This aesthetic freedom, which is present in aesthetic experience, now implies a different kind of self-relation of the subject, different relation to nature, and a distinct kind of social relation. That aesthetic experience implies a certain self-relation is abundantly clear in Kant. When I judge an object to be beautiful, I do so because its representation gives rise to a free yet ununanimous play of my faculties. I perceive its beauty, as it were, through the self-relation which the object elicits in me. Through the aesthetic experience of beauty, I gain access to a new form of subjective unity that does not require the subordination of one part of myself under the other, but rather creates an unforced and reciprocal unity of my faculties. So that's something that Schiller obviously explores in much further detail than Kant. This is a play that sustains and nourishes itself, and I do not relate here to this unity through an abstract intellectual judgment that asserts or prescribes this unity as good, but rather I realize this play through a feeling of pleasure. Regarding the second dimension, I experience this unity not as something that is opposed to the object of experience, but rather as something that is directly in contact with the object. I experience my own unity in that beautiful object itself, which eludes my intellectual determination, but in which I nevertheless linger. Conversely, one can say that based on the unforced unity of my subjective faculties, I gain a kind of access to the external object that goes beyond its theoretical subsumption under given concepts, as well as its instrumentalization for the achievement of subjective purposes. So our general kind of relation to nature in Kant would be this, that we subsume it under our given concepts. So we have a theoretical relation to it in which we can know it, bring it under concepts. Or we have a practical relation to it where we make it the means to attain our subjectively posited ends. But here we have a relation to nature that is different. That's neither subsumption nor instrumentalization. In my aesthetic judgment, I refer to the external object not as an instance of a type, but relate to the individual object as such. Not flowers in general, but this flower here is beautiful. I now access this object in an intelligibility and generality that is rooted in itself and present in its sensible form itself. The attitude in which the object reveals itself to the subject in this new way lies in an interesting way between a contemplative and a practical attitude. On the one hand, the relation is more contemplative than practical, insofar as the object does not appear as a means to subjectively set ends, but only appears under the condition of abstraction from such subjective ends. On the other hand, the representation of the object sustains itself and, in this sense, reproduces itself. If the practical is characterized by the fact, and that's Kant's definition from the second critique, that the representation is the cause of the object's reality. So Kant thinks the practical is this: I have a representation of something, and the representation itself is the source of the thing becoming real. So I have an intention, I realize my intention. So the representation is the cause of the actuality of the object. So, and if we take this as the general kind of form that the practical has, we have to say that aesthetic pleasure has a practical dimension to it. Namely, in aesthetical pleasure, Kant describes aesthetic pleasure in such a manner that it's a certain kind of representation that sustains itself and reproduces itself. That kind of brings it. If I encounter pleasure, I want to reproduce what I found pleasurable. And an aesthetic pleasure is of such a kind that it strengthens and supports itself in a certain way. So therefore, it seems that it has this kind of practical aspect to it. Yes, and Kant also expresses this by saying that beauty appears, this kind of practical dimension, beauty appears to us as purposive without a purpose. So it has this kind of purposiveness that we connect to the practical, but there is no given purpose that we realize. So it's purposive in this indeterminate manner. This is not simply a matter of something that has a purpose that we do not yet know. One finds a tool and doesn't know what it's for. Rather, the purposiveness of the object is essentially indeterminate and goes beyond any determination it may find through a particular instrumentation. The aesthetic self-relation and relation to the external object now also implies a special social relation that is present in the modality of aesthetic judgments. And with this, I finally come now to my title, Sensus Communis, or common sense. The definition of the aesthetic with which I began was: beauty is that which pleases universally without a concept. When I judge something to be beautiful, I'm not merely stating that I happen to like it, but that it has a necessary relation, but I state that it has a necessary relation to pleasure, notwendige Beziehung auf das Wohlgefallen, that concerns everyone. The object is not universally pleasing in the sense that every object of the same kind is pleasing. The judgment always refers only to the unique object of aesthetic experience. That it is universally pleasing thus means that in our aesthetic judgment, we assume that it must please every subject in this way. When I experience something as beautiful, I claim that everyone else should also experience this object as beautiful. To call it beautiful means precisely to make this claim and to always already address myself to others with my judgment. So saying something is beautiful, I cannot just be talking to myself. If I say this is beautiful, or I have this feeling of it's beautiful, it's as if I look around in the room and look to others to agree with me. Yeah. So making this judgment means directing myself at others in an immediate way on Kant's account. And this also means I experience my pleasure to be communicable and immediately relevant to others. And interestingly, Kant also makes clear, so finding my judgments to be communicable, so being something that I share with others, can share with others, adds to the pleasure I take in it. Yeah. So sometimes people describe it as if this were a second order pleasure. So Longness says this. So yeah, I have pleasure in the beauty of the object, and then I have a second order pleasure in the communicability of this kind of pleasure. I think this is drawing the two aspects apart in the wrong way, but analytically as a distinction, it's helpful to make clear to you that the aesthetic pleasure I take is also the pleasure I take in its own communicability. Now, the necessity that is implied in the aesthetic judgment is, as Kant puts it, not a theoretical necessity of the kind that allows me to recognize a priori that what I recognize as beautiful will please everyone else. So that it's not that kind of necessity. I know this has to please everyone else. Nor is it the practical necessity where pleasure is the necessary consequence of a rational determination, and I can prescribe to everyone else they must like it. So you could think either I know everyone will agree, or maybe I don't know that everyone in fact will agree, but I know everyone ought to agree because it is a practical pleasure that is prescribed by the moral law. And so then I could prescribe it to you. I could tell you, you need to understand this. You need to feel this to be beautiful. But the pleasure in the aesthetic is necessary, but in a different way. I can't prescribe it to you. Yeah, and that brings me into a different kind of relation to you, a more social, more socially, I think a more social relation to you. All right. So I can prescribe it to you, and the necessity that is implied in aesthetic judgment is rather of the following form. It is the necessity exemplified by my own particular experience, calling upon you to agree with my judgment. So I offer myself as an example, as exemplary. And Kant also puts it in this way: it is a necessity that cannot rely on any a priori reasons and could not, cannot rely on any a priori reasons that could compel everyone to agree. I cannot force you to agree with me. The necessity can therefore be called unforced or free. I can't compel you to agree. I ask you to agree, and I say it's necessary. If this is a judgment of beauty that I have here, then you need to agree, but I can't force you to. At the same time, it means that this necessity does not realize itself, as we might say, automatically. Rather, it depends for its realization on the aesthetic subject, who must stand by their judgment and call upon others to agree with the subject's own aesthetic judgment. In German, I would say you need the Einsatz des Subjekts. So you need to put yourself on the line in a certain sense in order to realize this necessity, to make it real. The principle on which the subject relies in realizing the free necessity is what Kant now calls sensus communis. According to Kant, sensus communis should not be understood as common sense, gemeiner oder gesunder Menschenverstand, which is not actually a sense at all, but proceeds according to concepts, even though they are articulated in a dim way. Actual common sense, sensus communis aestheticus, on the other hand, is indeed a sense, albeit not a given external sense, but a sense that is to be understood as the effect of the free play of our cognitive powers. So eine Wirkung, it's a Wirkung. A sense, therefore, that is awakened by my experience of beauty itself and realized through the active play of my mental powers. According to Kant, a judgment of taste can only be made under the presupposition of such a common sense. How exactly should this presupposition now be understood of the common sense? When I declare something to be beautiful, I imply that everyone else should agree with me, even though my judgment is not based on a shared concept, but only on a feeling. If I actually demand the agreement of others, I obviously cannot rely on my private feeling here, but must base my judgment on some communal feeling, or some communal feeling, gemeinschaftliches Gefühl, as an ideal norm. Our arrogation, Anmaßung to past judgments of taste shows that we actually presuppose this indeterminate norm of a common sense, Kant suggests. Now, one might assume that Kant introduces this sensus communis in the sense of an assurance of a pre-established ground or harmony between us. I assume a common sensibility I share with others, a form of attunement, we could say with Khurana, which I can neither further justify nor need to justify. It's just a gift I can rely on. It's something given, ein gegebenes, hinzunehmendes. And this kind of assurance gives me the confidence to make a judgment, aesthetic judgment, with the right kind of certainty. That is beautiful. This is how it is. However, this is not how the common sense we make reference to operates according to Kant. The presupposition of common sense does not serve as an assurance, nor does it allow me to simply retreat to the given evidence of my aesthetic feelings. On the contrary, it requires me to measure myself against the judgment of everyone else, Kant says, in the aesthetic judgment, and to try to convince others of the beauty of what I aesthetically appreciate. So common sense is not an assurance, but a task that implies the inevitability of aesthetic criticism, that I expose myself to the judgments of others and criticize their contrary judgments. In aesthetic judgments, I am aware of the arrogation that its reach into the general involves. The presupposition of common sense is therefore not felt as the positive certainty of having a common foundation, but rather obliges me to develop this foundation and commits me to a priori consideration of everyone else's way of thinking, to hold my judgment, as it were, to the entire human understanding, as Kant also puts it. By making an aesthetic judgment, and thus always already presupposing the possibility of a common feeling or sense, I address myself to others and locate myself in the community of other aesthetic subjects. Common sense is community sense, as Hannah Arendt aptly puts it. In this sense, aesthetic judgment is one that is made by an I that is we and a we that is an I. In case of aesthetic experience, the case of aesthetic experience makes it clear that this sociality does not occur through the subsumption of the judging subjects under a common form and the subsumption of the judge objects under a general general concept. So we could think this kind of sociality of this kind of universal sociality is kind of being formed by a double subsumption. I subsume myself under a common form that I share with you, and therefore we can agree on this. And I subsume the object under a given concept. And if I do it this way, then it's clear on the basis of the concept, I could even force you, compel you to agree with me if you are of the same sort. But that's not how the agreement is being formed here through this kind of double subsumption. I judge the object of my, but rather what happens is I judge the object of my concrete experience in its uniqueness as beautiful. It is this object that I find beautiful, so I don't subsume it under a concept. And when I ask others to agree with me, this also means that I'm asking them to take my place and allow themselves to be moved by the object in the same unique way that I was moved. Conversely, when I take into account the way any other person experiences this thing, I must do so by putting myself in their place. We therefore do not form a class of subjects in which each person instantiates the type common to all. Rather, we form a community of individuals who represent each other in experience and who seek to determine a universality that exists only through the individuals themselves. We therefore do not adopt a universal voice by giving up our own, but rather by inhabiting this universal voice as our own. Aesthetic judgment is thus what Cavell calls a claim to community, a judgment that claims a universality without being able to secure it in advance, and in which each individual always exposes themselves to the danger of being rejected in their claim, of having to experience that the claimed community does not yet exist or does no longer exist. I believe Hannah Arendt is therefore right when she considers Kant's third critique in some sense to be his political philosophy. Of course, it is not political in the sense that Kant defined the system of political institutions here, but he characterizes the political form of the social through the modality of aesthetic judgments. The political is marked by the exemplary necessity that we encounter in the aesthetic. It depends on the arrogation with which I in its singularity attempts to say what we mean, think, experience, or want. It depends on the presupposition of a common sense, which, however, must be redeemed by holding our judgment to the possible judgment of everyone else. In the medium of the aesthetic, Kant thus clarifies the political character of the sociality that distinguishes the genus-being. Let me briefly summarize and pinpoint what we can learn from Kant's definition of aesthetic experience with regard to the genus-being. By relating to myself as the living genus, I constitute myself as a universal and free being, says Marx. Kant explains how this may happen in the medium of aesthetic experience and how I gain a special form of aesthetic universality and aesthetic freedom that corresponds to the genus-being. This other form of universality and freedom opens up a different understanding of what a free self-relation or a relation to nature, a free relation to nature and a free relation to other subjects could be. In aesthetic experience, I encounter my own unity as a subject as a reciprocal, productive, unanimous interplay of my various cognitive powers. In this sense, my freedom is not the subordination of my sensible nature to the imperatives of the understanding, but a lawfulness without law. Self-determination is therefore not self-domination, but a relation to myself that is as spontaneous as it is receptive. Secondly, my freedom does not consist in my ability to subsume external nature for theoretical purposes and to instrumentalize it for practical purposes. My free relation to external nature is unity in difference or contact. Without appropriating nature in an intrusive way, it is experienced in a singular encounter in such a way that it touches the subject without coinciding with it. The liberating character of this experience for the subject lies essentially in the fact that it is driven beyond its acquired, conceptually determined identity and experiences a deeper, more open-ended intelligibility of the world. It is in its encounter with this other that the subject is driven beyond the freedom of self-domination and becomes involved in the freedom of play. This freedom is not the freedom of the subject alone, but at the same time liberates the object of aesthetic experience. The subject becomes free from nature in the sense of becoming free from its dualistic relationship to it, only by simultaneously liberating itself in nature and liberating nature itself. The aesthetic experience ultimately goes hand in hand with a free relation to other subjects, which is neither the freedom of the always already shared common form, nor the freedom of arbitrariness against others. It thus transcends the two paradigms of practical freedom that dominate Kant's philosophy, Wille und Willkür, will and arbitrariness. The subject is not free by being subject to a pre-existing shared law, but neither does it indulge in mere arbitrariness. It has an exemplary experience of necessity and universality, which it suggests to others, which is suggested to it by others. This is not the freedom of will or arbitrariness, but maybe the freedom of choice, Wahl. A choice that essentially happens to that's a choice that essentially happens to one. It is free in its relation to others in that it shares with them a universality that remains to be determined and that can only be established through the unique exemplary experiences of all. The subject can only be liberated to the freedom of this common sense through its relation to others. Now, at this point, I would I'm going into the paper. There follows a third step, in which I try to do the following. So, you could say up until this point, I've just talked about aesthetic experience in Kant. Yeah? And if you recall what Marx wrote in the Paris Manuscripts, he was actually not talking about aesthetic experience, but our capacity to produce according to the laws of nature. So you could be of the opinion that, well, all that I said might be interesting, but it's actually beside the point, because Marx is interested in how we produce aesthetically, but not how we experience nature in an aesthetic manner. And therefore, in that third section, I try to show that following from his account of aesthetic experience in Kant, there's another element of his aesthetic theory that's given short shrift in the literature, mostly because people think natural beauty and his experience is the main thing. But he gives you an account of our fine art and beautiful art as well. And I take it, and that's what I try to show there, is that in a certain sense, the kind of production that he describes as the production of beautiful art is the kind of production that a being that has experienced itself as a genus being, like we do in aesthetic experience, that produces, that becomes active in the world on this basis, so that tries to realize itself not as a species being, but as a genus being in the world. So realizing this kind of universality, this kind of free self-relation, free relation to nature and free relation with others in the world requires aesthetic production in the world. Yeah, and that's what I try to show in the third part. I'm very happy to discuss it in the discussion, but I don't want to strain your patience any longer, and we'll now just come to the conclusion. I've attempted to show that Kant's work allows us to understand more precisely how aesthetic experience and production, the latter I haven't shown, but it's in the text, how those aesthetic experiences and productions reveal a self-relation, a relation to others, and a relation to nature, which Marx understood as that of the genus being. The universality and freedom that Marx attributes to the genus being can be understood, as Kant's elaboration suggests, as an aesthetic universality and an aesthetic freedom that goes beyond the freedom of self-domination and the domination over nature. This involves two fundamental insights, I think, one negative, one positive. Negatively, Kant's aesthetic model provides us with resources to question the modern relation to self and world, which is characterized by a form of impositionism and a lack of freedom that stands in tension with the modern self-understanding of autonomy. As becomes apparent in the aesthetic, the subject of self-domination and domination of nature is less free than it thinks it is. Secondly, that's the positive side, there is a different kind of experience and a different mode of operation that is being developed by Kant that goes beyond this impositionism without abandoning the idea of self-determination. So that's what's most interesting to me. You could think, if what I've said is true, so if this kind of self-domination model and the domination of nature is so problematic that's part of autonomy, we might think, well, we have to give up the idea, the notion that we need to be self-determined or that freedom is self-determination, and think about a different kind of conception of freedom. But what's interesting about Kant's third critique and this aesthetic model is he holds on to the idea of self-determination. I think quite clearly Hegel and Marx do too. They try to develop a conception of freedom where freedom is self-determination. So they hold on to conception of self-determination, but a different way of understanding it that goes past that moves past this model of autonomy if understood as self-domination. So we have not a departure from self-determination, but rather a deepening of the idea of self-determination. Kant's achievement in both regards, the negative and the positive, seems considerable to me. Now, at the same time, both the critique and the positive alternative are limited in an important way, and I just want to mark those limitations in the end before I stop. Kant does not explicitly, first limitation, Kant does not explicitly examine the social causes of this false relation to self and the world that's part of the self-domination model. This is precisely the ambition that Marx associates with his analysis of our genus being, to trace the problematic mode of self-domination, domination over nature, and domination of others back to a social and economic dynamic that alienates us from our genus being. So in the Kantian model, we have contrasting models of freedom, but we do not have any explanation why we have held on to the wrong one. Yeah, why we are kind of entrapped in this self-understanding that we have, and And that then also suggests why we cannot just leave this constellation by opting for an aesthetic conception of freedom. So we cannot just say, I'd like to have an aesthetic freedom, so that's it. But rather, we need to change our practices if we want to move in that direction. A second limitation, the other form of experience and operation with which art familiarizes us remains undefined in Kant insofar as its social location is not further characterized. It remains unclear how aesthetic art relates to the mechanical art of satisfying needs and achieving conceived purposes in a social context. Is aesthetic art the medium for reflecting on the limitations of our everyday quasi-mechanical operations? Or is it conceivable that it could represent the all-encompassing form of practice in which the mechanical arts are given a subsidiary role? So could it be the case that our ethical life is actually an art? Could this be the case? And so mechanical and productive relations to nature be just have just a subsidiary role within that? Or is art just a way in which we can relieve ourselves of the pressures of our normal kinds of practices? This is a large, I would say this is basically undiscussed in Kant. So he brings to the fore this interesting other model of our self-understanding that is part of aesthetic experience, but how it actually is to be related to our ethical life more generally remains quite obscure. All right. The return to Kant thus has allowed us to understand more precisely the inner nexus between aesthetic experience and practice on the one hand and genus being on the other, which Marx merely hinted at. However, in order to understand the social location, the possible social institutionalization, and also the possible pathologies of an aesthetic realization of the genus being, we must move from Kant back to Marx and probably also beyond Marx into the analysis of aesthetic capitalism. But I must leave these two subsequent steps for another occasion. Thanks so much for your patience.
Yeah, thank you very much, Thomas, for this wonderful talk. And now we have a couple of minutes for questions. So please raise your virtual hand if you want to ask something to the author. Okay, we have two questions, Gino and then Jorge Quispe, please.
Yeah, thanks. My question might sound a bit like an objection, but it's just curiosity about how you deal with this, and it's about how you would deal with kind of like Foucauldian critique of that has already been leveled up against Marx of how this idea of genus being kind of replicates or continues reproduces the logic of like, let's say, dealing with human nature, right? A set of like universal truths about humans that then kind of like make up our theory of like what being human entails, right? And I guess what Foucault would say is, well, some set of like things that we associate with human nature end up being more like the product of historical processes, right? And that goes for like labor, for work, in the case of Marx. But I've seen that also with aesthetics, right? Like how at least some anthropologists right now, I don't remember any name right now, but I've seen some anthropologists say how even the idea of aesthetic judgment has historical background, right? The idea of understanding beauty as this kind of like indeterminateness of the object is a product of specifically like modern European societies in which we can actually dissociate like the art product from like any kind of social specific function, right? Like in other societies, you have more of an overlapping between I don't know, like ritualistic processes and the objects that you use in them that you can appreciate as beautiful, but serve a specific function, right? So in that sense, taking that into account, I don't know how you would deal with this possible critique, I guess, of understanding this human set of characteristics as historically determined.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, so I mean, implicitly, there might be two criticisms in there. So one criticism with regard to this could be that it's an anthropocentric framework. So it's just very much centered around us in a sense. So if we have the Foucauldian architecture in the In les mots et les choses, it tries to describe the ways in which this kind of organizing the whole epistemic realm, the whole relation between words and things around us is weird and is a historical contingency, and centering everything around us in this sense is of a limited limited value, and it's a kind of a framework that we are about to or should leave behind. So that's of course one direction we might take, and I might come back to this other way of asking the question. But you were more specifically asking now about the ways in which, or raising the objection, making the objection in such a fashion that having this concept of a genus being in the center and the way in which the human is distinctive implies a certain kind of ahistorical perspective. So I tell you what the human being is like and what their features is, and I describe what aesthetic experience for a human being is in ahistorical terms, and this is not really doing justice to these phenomena, which are highly historical, right? And now the interesting thing is, it's true that in terms of the way in which Kant frames this question, this historical dimension doesn't play a big role. Yeah. So in that sense, what I take from Kant is just some language to understand our own condition, so our historical situation, and to understand what Marx might have in mind when he thinks that we can produce according to laws of nature, that genus beings can produce according to laws of beauty. So it's true that there is not this historical index in Kant. The developed concept of a genus being, however, in Marx is highly historical. So the whole framework he gives there is historical. So people tend to think that in the Paris Manuscript, what Marx does is he suggests, well, we are genus beings, so this is our ontological condition. This is what humans are by nature, it would seem, or by the mode of their being. And then for some reason, we are alienated from it. We have to get back at it. But I think this is not true. I think what he suggests or describes rather is that by virtue of, so he says that that history is the natural history of man. So that means human history, the process of human history, is our natural history, is the way by which we have acquired our nature, or our nature has arisen. So if it's true that our nature is to be genus beings, it's through the process of history that we have become genus beings. It's not immediate. It's not just something that's a given. It's something that through history we become and we end up being. And then interestingly, we start being genus beings in an alienated form. So we start being genus beings in such a form that this kind of universality and freedom that we use just as a means in order to sustain ourselves as living beings. So when he describes the animality of the laborer under capitalism, he suggests that we have this genus being, we have this kind of sociality, this inherent cooperation with others. We have this kind of universality that's part of our doing, but we just use it we treat it as if it's not the purpose of our existence to realize and express this kind of feature of our existence. Labor also, right? Labor is the activity through which we realize our genus being, and we don't treat labor as the expression of our own being, but rather we treat it as a means toward an end, the means to the end of providing ourselves with resources to sustain our natural existence, to reproduce our natural existence. And then that has the effect also on the laborer, that they, as he says, they feel most free, most at home in their animal activities, in their animal functions, but completely alienated in their spiritual functions. Those aspects that distinguish them as genus beings, those are just encountered or experienced as something that compels them or that's alienated from them. And so that means this level of our existence, this essential part of our existence, we first realize in an alienated form. And so we yet have to become, you could say, genus beings by overcoming this form of alienation. So by making this kind of genus activity our actual activity and be the center of our own life form, and not just the means towards the end of reproducing, of securing our natural reproduction. So that means in the Marxian framework, I'm not worried at all that this kind of conception is ahistorical. So that's just not the case in Marx. With regard to Kant, I grant that there is no strong historical index there, but maybe this I think this could be elaborated. So I mean, I think it's nevertheless useful to draw on Kant in order to elaborate the structure of aesthetic experience and aesthetic production in general terms. I think that's still valid. Now, with regard to the question of anthropocentrism, I think in a certain sense I will have to bite the bullet that it is anthropocentric to a certain degree, and accept it that this needs to be the case. And if we see this against the background of the challenges of the Anthropocene and the ways in which we have moved ourselves with our form of life into a catastrophic ecological crisis and so on, there's a strong movement in theory, at least, maybe not in philosophy, but in philosophy and theory, to move beyond that by, in a certain sense, questioning the fundamental difference between the human and the non-human and equalizing this kind of relation. Yet, I don't think this is fully convincing in the following manner. So what we are talking about, if we are talking about this crisis of this life form, I think has to do with the way in which certainly brings out a misguidedness of our conception of freedom and of our life form. So that's clear. And a certain misguidedness of the ways in which we think we are above nature and we are independent of it. We are kind of drawn by the fantasy of being independent of it, because being these kinds of genus beings that are above just being a species being seems to elevate us to a level in which we lift off and are kind of independent from it, or superior to everything else in nature. So I can see how you could make the case that this anthropocentric framework invites this kind of misunderstanding or this kind of position. But I don't think that it is helpful to try to suggest that we just level the difference or don't think about the specific kind of life form that we have. Because it's also a fact that if there are other living creatures in the history of the Earth that had terraforming effects, and bacteria, for example, had those, you would not make them responsible for it. You would not judge them. It's not their fault in a certain sense, and it's not objectionable in any way. Us doing this is problematic in a different manner because we are self-conscious living beings, and because we are genus beings, because we can understand our own universality and the general character of other things in the world. So that means I think I have to accept that I want to suggest we are distinctive in certain ways, even though I'm not interested in, and I don't think I need to be committed to suggesting we are the only living animals that have any rationality to them. So this kind of crude opposition between the animal and the human, this is unnecessary. But to suggest that only self-conscious living beings have a specific kind of responsibility, and that they have that that they have specific kind of responsibility, I think this is acceptable. And as I also try to make clear, this kind of anthropocentrism, or this kind of way in which we even distinguish ourselves in a certain way, makes this interesting, has this interesting dialectical feature that what distinguishes us is awareness of something that connects us to everything else. And so this means it's just awareness of something, and therefore the capacity to give greater significance to something that connects us. So what distinguishes us is completely related, is dependent upon what connects us to the rest of nature. Therefore, understanding this kind of distinctiveness more properly can show you in the first place why it's misguided to have this this idea of a domination of nature or superiority, independence of the human being, independence of nature.
Thank you. We have a second one, this time from Jorge Quispe. I will read it from the chat, okay?
Okay, yeah.
Okay, he says, in your lecture, it was mentioned that a specific determination of the Gattungswesen is the self-relation. There is a Marxian concept that appears not only in Marx's writings on materialism, but also in those ones on politics, Selbstständigkeit, self-activity. How important is this concept to understand the Gattungswesen and Marx's materialism in general? And where can we find the first draft of this concept in the history of philosophy? For example, Kant uses it to refer to the synthesis of understanding as a spontaneous act of the subject in the critique of pure reason.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, I think it's essential. This concept of Selbsttätigkeit, it's very important and very very key to Marx. And it is all over the place in German idealism. As you mentioned, it is present in Kant's conception of spontaneity. It looms large in Fichte. So in Fichte, it has a specific important role. But in terms of not in terms of the term so much of Selbsttätigkeit, but in terms of the what is at issue or the matter of the kind of the Sache, it's very present in Hegel as well. So this kind of Selbsttätigkeit. Now, Marx gives a specific kind of inflection to it, and that might be interesting. So Marx is very interested in this term in terms of accepting or highlighting the aspect of Tätigkeit here. That's the first thing. And secondly, highlighting the ways in which we have to understand Selbsttätigkeit on a sensible level. So in the Feuerbach-Thesen, this is very prominent. So there he says, German idealism is completely right. We have to understand Selbsttätigkeit. But their mistake was, and then also with regard to Feuerbach, he says that he's right about that. But the mistake is in a certain sense that it is limited to the ideal conceptual rational sphere and that we don't see the ways in which sensibility is informed by this kind of Selbsttätigkeit. Yeah. So he tries to suggest that Selbsttätigkeit happens or is realized on a sensible material level, if you will. And he highlights the ways in which Selbsttätigkeit is a practical activity, so it's a practical accomplishment. And both things kind of move beyond what German idealism accepts. So if you have the kind of paradigm case of Selbsttätigkeit in Kant, as you rightly point out, it's transcendental apperception and the pure spontaneity of the understanding. And this is kind of an immediate activity that seems to have no resistance. It doesn't have any kind of true practical flavor to it. If you want to suggest that practical activity is kind of the activity of a subject that's engaged with something external, that is encountering that resistance, that has to work through something, has to pervade something, but it's a pure activity that has no resistance and that just produces, like out of itself, what it needs to have. And so the kind of practical activity or Tätigkeit that Marx is interested in is not of that sort. So it's a true Tätigkeit. It's something that requires work. It has more the quality of labor. And so that's in that sense he takes more seriously the practical character, you could say, of Selbsttätigkeit. And that connects closely to the second point that I tried to make, namely that he wants to place this on the level of sensibility and of our material natural existence. So die Selbsttätigkeit is not just a prerogative of a pure capacity of the understanding that's somehow places us in some intelligible realm, but it's in the sensible world that this kind of Selbsttätigkeit is present. Yes, but I think it's quite essential to this kind of activity, spontaneity in the self-relation is essential to the genus being. But it's also true what I just said, that Marx wants to suggest that in the case of the genus being, this happens on the level of sensibility, and it happens by virtue of true real embodied practical activity. So that's the way in which we do realize our genus being. I hope this was an appropriate response to the question. If not, then please please come back with a follow-up in the chat.
Okay, thank you. Now, Suresh, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Khurana. So first of all, I would like to thank you for because when I read this sentence in the EPM that man produces according to aesthetic, I could not possibly understand what could he possibly mean by aesthetic standard. And now I have some way to go about it. So thank you for that. But I have two questions, very brief one. So you say that man is, I mean, in this context, man is not merely rational, but also aesthetic being. So when you say that merely rational and ascribe additional quality of being aesthetic, so do you mean that it is something extra? Like, you mean something extra to rationality in terms of like we make the distinction between plant as vegetative life and animals as sensational and man as a rational being. So in that sense, this aesthetic dimension adding something extra in that sense, or is it part of something? Is it not something extra in that sense, but part of being a rational being? Being aesthetic is just part of being rational being and is not something qualitatively adds something qualitatively distinct, as for example being sensational adds something qualitatively distinct from being vegetative or merely plant in that sense. And secondly, in all of these, it's just out of pure curiosity, uh, what does Hegel's aesthetics has to, if it has to do anything at all in this? So yeah, just that.
Okay, thank you. Yes, with regard to the first question, yes, maybe the kind of formulation you referred to was easy to misunderstand. So I didn't want to suggest that we are rational beings, and then there comes another layer on top that is added to it and suggests we are beyond being rational beings. We are also then, and that means that's a different thing, aesthetic beings. But you're right that rather what I was interested it was to suggest that having these aesthetic capacities, this capacity for aesthetic experience and aesthetic production is part of being rational and part of being fully rational, of being rational in a more deeper sense and a more integrated sense than is the case if we are limited to the you could say the rationality of the understanding. So if you work from a Hegelian framework, you could say the rationality of a being that's capable of subsuming nature under given concepts and that's capable of instrumentalizing nature for their own posited practical purposes is a creature that's rational in the sense of being rational in the mode of the understanding. Verstandes, so Hegel sometimes said that's a Verstandeskonzeption, the understanding conception of rationality. Whereas someone that's a creature that has really true reason must be capable of integrating their various capacities in a different manner. And so in a rational creature that is a reasonable creature that has reason in this fully developed sense, there needs to be some kind of more of a kind of a organic totality in that self, and not the subordination of one faculty under the other. And the aesthetic describes exactly that, this kind of organic integration of our various faculties. So you could say having these aesthetic capacities or fully actualizing it means to be rational in the full sense of the word. All right, and so what could Hegel's aesthetic do in this context? That's an interesting question. So I think what struck me in a certain sense is so why did I go to Kant and not to Hegel? So what's interesting I think that in many respects they are quite close to each other. They think that the realm of art has something to do with renegotiating the relation between nature and freedom, reconciling it in a new form. So that they agree basically on this account. And in the idea that the beautiful is das sinnliche Schein der Idee, or the idea as being present in an individual entity, So you have an individual, concrete thing, a singular thing that at the same time expresses something universal. You also have great resonance there. You also have they also agree in the sense that this kind of universality here is present on the level of sense. So if you have an aesthetic presentation of the universal or the general, it's not through concepts, but it's through some sensible thing and through my sensible reception of it. So in all of this, there is some basic agreement, I would suggest. I think that I find that I thought that Kant's way of putting things is interesting and in a certain sense has a sharper critical edge that was helpful to what I wanted to do, in a sense in which Kant starts from the idea that the aesthetic is a judgment without concept. So something pleases me generally, universally, without concept. And so he treats these kinds of aesthetic judgments in such a manner that in some sense or form, we suspend this kind of subordination or subsumption of things under concepts and deactivate this mode of judgment. The typical normal mode of judgment is bring something under a concept, and we kind of deactivate this. And so this idea is not as present in Hegel. Obviously, I said it's placed on a level of sense, so therefore it's not conceptual in this way, but this kind of negative edge in a certain sense, that it's also experienced, that Kant makes clear that in a certain sense what we typically would describe as a lack or a failure of judgment. The judgment doesn't work. I can't bring it under a concept. I lack the concept. This is then made a productive experience and described in this way. So to have this kind of contrast between a species being, which is always guided by a given concept, or has this kind of normativity structure of subsumption under a given concept, and the genus being where you have an indeterminate universal standard. For this kind of purpose, this aspect of Kant's elucidation was helpful. And there's a second respect in which I thought Kant is very interesting. So Hegel does highlight the social character of art. So that's it's obviously not lost on Hegel. And he makes clear that a work of art is always not just something that we experience, but it's a conversation with anyone. He says it's a conversation with anyone that stands before it. So a work of art is an invitation to communicate in a certain sense. Yet Hegel does not highlight in the same manner as Kant does this kind of specific type of sociality and communicability that's part of the aesthetic. A way in which I'm universally connected to everyone, actually, in my aesthetic experience, yet without anything to back this up. I don't have any foundation on which I could compel you to like what I like. I just have my experience. I can just have myself. I have myself to present to you and urge you to call upon you to look at it the same way and to join me. And this kind of second personal kind of engagement, this irreducibly singular concrete experience that I have and that puts me into a second person relation with you, I don't think that Hegel would deny it, or that that's inimical to what Hegel says, or it's in contradiction to what he says. I don't think that at all. But it's nothing that he highlights in the account of aesthetic experience that he gives. So that's not being made explicit by Hegel in the same way it's made explicit in Kant. And therefore, I don't think that there is any tension actually between what Hegel thinks about the aesthetic and the things that I try to highlight, but that Kant's way of putting things is helpful for the things that I wanted to bring out, and that's why I turned there.
Yeah, thank you. That was pretty awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a question as well. So, could you clarify how we move from Marx's focus on production, I mean, the active side of Gattungswesen, so to speak, to Kant's focus on aesthetic judgment and the way universality is formed in encountering the other? I mean, I get that in both cases, one is not forcing an object or experience into a pre-given concept or subsuming them under a pre-given concept, but I still don't really see how we move from production to judgment, or how does this shift actually work according to your approach?
Yeah. So I didn't want to say we have to shift from production to judgment. So that I didn't want to suggest. It's true that in Marx, this kind of the productive aspect is essential in order to objectify my genus being, to realize myself as a genus being. But I think that Kant actually agrees there. But I think that in what Marx says or describes in this passage, he's already talking about this productive side there. But I think implicitly he's also talking about our receptivity or the way in which we relate to the world. He's suggesting that in a certain sense, animal beings in their relation to their world are guided or informed by their specific needs and by their specific given sensibilities, and they can only produce according to the standards of their own species and the standards of their and the needs and standards of their own species. Meaning, so in their interactive engagement with the world, they are informed and guided by their specific needs and limit to this outlook that they have by virtue of their given form, and suggest that human beings actually can go beyond that. And I take this to mean that, to be connected to Kant's thought in the following manner, that we could say, well, yeah, the animal beings, on Kant's account, he would say they also have a sense for the pleasurable, for the agreeable, das Angenehme, right? So they have some things that are in unity with them, that concord with what they are, that are agreeable to them, that they want to take in or want to be close to, and there are other things that they want to avoid. They have this kind of evaluative relation to the world. And human beings do have that too, but they have a different way of relating to the world that is not limited to what their given needs or their given standards of what they find agreeable. So they have a different kind of sensibility and take on the world. And I take it that even though Marx is not concerned with this as a separate issue or just specifically about experience, he wants to bring this other relation to the world out. And he already does so in the context of production, but I don't think that this means he isn't interested in the sensibility thing as well. I mean, this is also comes out in the Paris Manuscripts. He's very interested in the way in which the sensibility that we have, the senses that we have, are a product of our history and have evolved in a certain sense through the ways in which humans have actively engaged with each other and the world. So we have kind of educated, transformed our sensibility in ways in which you could say our sensibility is more open-ended and also in a certain sense more the product of our own doing than is the sensibility of merely animal beings. So I didn't want to. So I left out part 3. So what I wanted to do with part 3, I know it's even in the written part. It's short, but I wanted to say that Kant just makes explicit this receptivity side, this experiential side, more clearly. How in our receptive relation to the world, we have this capacity to find something beautiful. And in this, you can already see that we are not just species beings, but genus beings in this way. And then, but once we have established that then also involves that this requires now of myself that I realize myself and my practical activity in a different way. And the way in which he describes works of art, they are productions of such a sort that in those productions, I do not just produce, to produce a work of art. In producing a work of art, I do not just work from a plan that I try to realize, like an artisan would. Yeah, I have a plan of a table, then I realize it in the sensible material. But rather, we have a more open-ended kind of process of creation in which I aim to bring something forth that supersedes my intention. I try to bring something forth that goes beyond everything that I intended and that also lifts off my intention, that becomes independent of it. So I create something that seems to rest upon its own, so that rests on its own feet in a certain sense. So that has this value, that has this kind of inherent value to itself, independent of the fact that I had the plan to produce it and then produced it. Yeah. And so I think that Kant's account of aesthetic production then is Kantian, that in a certain sense you could think that Kant has established by way of aesthetic experience a different account of the kinds of beings that we are, and artworks are the kinds of products that beings like that should be producing, or are the kinds of products that beings like that produce and thereby realize or prove or actualize their genus being. And if we think like that, then the interesting follow-up question would be, is there anything of this aesthetic dimension of production in Marx as well? Yeah, because obviously Marx is at first just talking about labor and technical processes of production, which typically would not be described in aesthetic terms. Yeah, so it's not, and it certainly doesn't involve the genius kind of creativity that Kant is so interested in. Yeah. But I still think that Marx is interestingly that there are interesting ways in which Marx has a take on production in which it has this kind of aesthetic quality to it. Firstly, in the most general sense, that he describes the product of production or of labor, where you can understand it as the realization of a genus being, as being an expressive activity, an activity of manifestation. So in producing something, in laboring, in having a labor relation to the world and transforming the world, the main goal is not to create something that's useful to do something. The main function of it is to do that, but by virtue of doing that, it has the additional function, and this is even the more essential one, to manifest my genus being in the world, to express myself, to make myself an object in the world that is shareable with others, communicable with others. So to manifest my existence of this as this universal being, that's the purpose of labor. And therefore also Marx says we produce best where we don't produce out of the urge and the need of having needs. Yeah. So where we produce under the pressure of needs, where we're hungry or thirsty or just need to do this in order to fulfill our needs, we don't produce in the best kind of way. I don't think that Marx wants to suggest that all needs need to be satisfied and then we have this kind of leisure activity in which we fully actualize ourselves. I think that when he says we are supposed to work free of needs, that he already thinks that some sense of collaborative kind of production does the trick. So if you look at the Mill excerpts and the kind of the passage, the famous passage where Marx tries to outline what would it mean to produce humanly, in a human manner, he says that what we do there is, I produce the projects for your needs and recognize you thereby, and you produce the products for my needs. And if we do that, I'm no longer producing under the pressure of need. I'm producing for a need, but not under the pressure, under being pushed by a need. But it's not, because it's not my need. I know that you will need this. I'm satisfied, I'm okay, and I'm now producing something for you. And so it's a social relation that we entertain. We take care of our needs. We reproduce our lives there, but we relieve ourselves of the pressure of the needs that forces us to do the mode of production. So there is this expressive function of labor. There is this kind of way in which it is supposed to be detached from the immediate urge and the immediate urges and needs that need to be fulfilled. So some degree of freedom with regard to that. And then in the ideas that Marx has, what a mode of production in a post-capitalist world could look like, he seems to suggest that a good kind of labor relation that we would have would require that we do not just mechanically do the same thing over and over and over again, so become just a cog in the machine, but have the ability and the freedom to develop all of our capacities and to be a fisherman in the afternoon and a poet in the evening and so on and so on. So this is kind of a romantic picture, of course, but it suggests that the most appropriate kind of activity or kind of productive activity of a genus being would be one that allows us a certain kind of universality of self-expression that comes close to a certain kind of understanding of what an artist is or does. And so therefore, I think that, I don't want to suggest that Marx is not interested mainly in this kind of productive world relation. So I think that's true. But I want to suggest, firstly, you can have that in Kant as well. And actually, the kind of productiveness that you find in Kant, this kind of aesthetic mode of production, is actually part of Marx's description of what a proper active world relation of a genus being would have to look like.
Thank you. So we have time for perhaps 2 more questions. Or 1 more question. Gino? And
Hey,
Fabian.
thanks. I guess just wanted to complement what was already said when I asked my first question. Just because you pointed out this idea of genus being in Marx being kind of like the result of a historical process, right? Of like not a given, but something that ends up being after, well, history basically. And that just made me think, I guess, in defense of Kant, of this small text by Kant, but I don't know how it's translated in English, or I don't even know the original name in German. It's the one about history, the cosmopolitan thing, in which Kant mentions how like a first principle of his teleological framing of history has to do with how every species, every living thing has to develop their own abilities or capacities, and that includes humans, right? The history of humans is development of that rationality, and enlightenment is specifically, right, the kind of like this point in history where reason has already been developed enough, so people can actually be autonomous and free. And I was thinking that to what you actually mentioned before about how the aesthetic judgment is also kind of like an expression of human reason specifically, right? I guess the freedom of it, right? So in that sense, I guess we can also find this historical perspective in Kant. Even aesthetic judgment requires some like historical conditions of possibility. Without them, like what we mentioned before about like the disinterested judgment or whatever wouldn't be possible. So I guess it is also possible to find that in Kant. I wanted to point that out. I don't know if like to pull that.
Yeah, thanks so much for this. Yes, you're quite right. You're quite right. I just wanted to concede that in the third critique itself, the framework is this kind of transcendental account that he gives, and he doesn't go into any kind of historical elaboration in this sense. But you're very right. In these small essays on history, they are very interesting. Also, I think very interesting to me. Also, this kinds the ways in which natural history plays a role there. And you're right that in this account, he describes history as a certain kind of development of the human capacities. And another feature that's quite interesting is the fact that he wants to suggest that, well, in order for us to develop the right kinds of capacities as a species, so nature has the intention of whenever it produces something to develop it fully, right? But in terms of the capacities of humans to develop the capacities of this species fully, you need this tool of this unsocial sociability. So you need this kind of interaction of humans with each other, but also the individualization. You need this kind of sociality that is kind of second personal in a certain sense. So not every individual can develop all the capacities. You need a long historical process, and you need to bring out the full potential of the species or the genus by virtue of this kind of social process of unsocial sociability. That's in terms of the kind of social structure that I see in place in the aesthetic, also quite interesting that you have this, that you don't have the idea that it's just by instantiating the same type, the type of the human again and again and again, and then just perfecting this in some sense or form. You have ever better instantiations of the same form or something like that. That's not how it works, but it's through this kind of social working and against and with each other that human beings develop and elaborate and manifest and actualize the potential that's in their species. And yes, and so what's also interesting in these historical essays is that Kant suggests that this kind of historical process or actualization of our rationality requires an interaction of imagination and reason. And so that's so interesting, because in his practical philosophy, he kind of suggests there is no practical imagination. So the imagination doesn't really play any role there. And in these historical essays, on the other hand, or contrasting with this, he suggests there's this kind of interplay between reason and imagination, and you need to cultivate their relation in order to fully actualize our rationality. And that very much would also argue in the direction of aesthetic reason having a role to play, or also it being a product of this history in a certain sense. So this kind of free play between reason and imagination that we have when we make an aesthetic judgment seems to be something that has evolved, or that is the product of a historical process of the sort that you find in these essays. So I think the suggestion is really good to look there if we wanted to find this kind of historical index of the genus being in Kant himself. Yeah, I think this makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Fabian, please.
Okay. Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. My question is the following. Early in the presentation, you mentioned that Marx writes in this sense that our genius character, which distinguishes us from other animals, is revealed in our ability to produce not only according to the laws of our own species, but according to the laws of every species. And I apologize if I misunderstood the argument, but while the later development of the argument makes clear that the idea of the human historical development and self-determination around the concept of genus being, I did not quite grasp how this extends to the laws of other species. Could you explain again this distinction and what Marx is reflecting on here? To understand this point is only necessary to appoint the fact that the genus being knows how to produce beyond the determination of natural necessity.
Yes, thanks so much. Yeah, it's not quite clear what he says there. So he doesn't say much more about it. So it's on us to try to elaborate what he's after. So the way I understand him is he's suggesting that both with regard to our needs as with regard to our to the way in which we produce, we are in a certain sense more universal, more unlimited, more open-ended than animal creatures. So in terms of, so what he says is not that we do produce according to the standard of every species, but that we know how to produce according to the standard of every species, and kind of suggests that we also care for this. And so the suggestion must be something like this. If you look at normal animal creatures, they don't typically emulate the way in which other creatures operate. They are not pretty much interested in studying other creatures in order to find out how they go about doing things. So you don't see an ant with their goggles and looking at other animals, trying to investigate what they do, describing the inner rationality of their life form, and giving life form descriptions, natural historical judgments about these other life forms. But human beings are extensively interested in other creatures, describing them, understanding the rationality or the inner connection of the various things that they do, study the way in which they operate. And in the kinds of products that we produce, and the technical products that we produce, you sometimes find in the philosophy of technology the idea that many of the artifacts that we produce are organ projections. But what we do is not just don't just project our own organs. So find an extension for our own kind of limb, but we seem to emulate organs of other living beings. So we try to produce things that allow us to fly. We try to produce things that allow us to swim. We try to become a being that's that can sustain itself or exist in all environments that are on Earth, right? So human beings have tried to populate every little bit of Earth. We are not adapted to living on the North Pole. We are not adapted to live in severe climates. We don't have any fur. We are not protected. We need to heavily build everything around us in order to be capable of doing so. So this way in which we are not tied in the same way to one limited environment, but try to emulate other living creatures and produce according to their standards, you could say, or kind of embellish our own corporality in such a manner that we use a fur of an animal in order to sustain ourselves in severe climates. This suggests that we produce according to the standard not just of our own species, but are open-minded, try to understand how other species do it and learn from it and enrich our own form of life by adopting certain modes of production, certain modes of behavior, certain modes of structuring our bodies that we see in other living creatures. So this is, I think, the basic understanding or intuition from which he works. And then he expands on this by saying that, but actually, so the structure of our own knowledge, if we really are serious about it, so we know, not only do we know how to produce according to all the known species that we have observed. So you could then say humans have observed a bunch of species and have seen how they produce, and now they know it, and so now they know in theory at least how to produce according to these standards, even if they haven't yet acquired the technical capacity to do so, or even if it's quite hard to say. I mean, if you have observed a bacterium, what would it mean to produce according to that? I mean, we are situated on a different scale, so how would we do that? But we know how to do it. So, but he doesn't even just say that we have accumulated the knowledge about certain set of species that we have investigated and now know how to produce according to their standard. But he says we know how to produce according to the standard of every species. That suggests to me he wants to say, having engaged with the world in the way we did and having elaborated conceptual realm in the way we did, there is no theoretical limit to the kinds of modes of production that we could acquire. So we have an open-ended, indeterminate capacity to produce, and that is what we draw upon. And I think that this kind of indeterminate or open-ended feature of our capacity to produce, this is what gives us the link to beauty, because beauty is the capacity to see something as normatively valid without any standard given, and also to produce in the absence of any given standard. So when I produce a beautiful work of art, at least that's how Kant and how Hegel understand it, I do not just follow poetic rules about how to produce a beautiful poem. Yeah? I do that to a certain extent. So there is a certain level of school and of mechanical art in every beautiful art. But the last thing that I do, the actual spark that I need, is not to be found in any rules and not to be found in any kind of preconception that I have, any kind of idea that I want to get across, but in some mode of production that I do without any standard being given. So in a sense, you could say an artist produces according to the standard of a species he does not know. He produces according to a standard of a species that is not yet found, not yet observed. Yeah, he produces something that has no place, and also no given use, no given place in our form of life, you could say. Yeah, and so that's the things that he thinks about, I think. So that's the intuition. That's how I understand the intuitions that must stand behind this. But I have to admit, he doesn't really say much more on this than the things that I've quoted. So I mean, there's some passages that might be interpreted as also making a point in that direction, but it doesn't say much more than this. So we are kind of left to our own devices here, extrapolating or speculating on what he could have had in mind.
Thank you. Do you have time, Thomas, for one last brief question?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, nice. So let me put that way. You're showing how for Marx being genus-being isn't something abstract or some abstract ideal, but a really concrete, embodied self-relation that is always tied to nature and to others. And then you link that to this human capacity to produce a quote according to the laws of beauty. Okay. So my question is, when we frame Marx's genius being in terms of this kind of universal, almost aesthetic mode of production, how do we avoid making it sound too harmonious or too smooth? Considering that it seems to me you're drawing a connection to republicanism through Hannah Arendt. Yeah? Like, doesn't this risk downplaying all the conflictual, messy, historically shaped form of dependence, dependent on nature, on others, on labor conditions that actually structure life under capitalism? I mean, what keeps this move toward beauty and universality from, let's say, glossing over the contradictions Marx could think are constitutive of Gattungswesen?
Yeah, so I can totally see this danger. So what I try to do is not to say the most important thing about the Gattungswesen is this kind of aesthetic line that he gives there. I was suggesting this is quite interesting and strange that he says this here. What could he mean? And how could this be based in the tradition he's coming out of? And how could this be maybe not just strange, but informative or instructive? How could this give us a different kind of take on the type of self-relation, relation to nature and relation to others that we need, that we need to look for. And so in that sense, I didn't want to suggest this is the best way of understanding Gattungswesen. Understanding it aesthetically is the most appropriate way of doing it. So that I didn't want to suggest, but it was more exploratory. What could he mean possibly here? And let's look at Kant in order to help us understand what this could possibly mean. But in terms of the more substantively, so isn't this too harmonious? You are right about the. I mean, first two things we have to keep in mind. So the kind of model that in the aesthetic experience is being explained would be the kind of self-relation, relation to nature, relation to others that is to be attained and is not yet present in alienated relations of capitalism. So that's not our situation. And that means also getting there, if I'm right, so that I try to make the distinction between Kant and Marx here, saying that Kant has no explanation for why we haven't realized this. So there's no reason why. If that's the deeper conception of reason that's possible, why shouldn't this be the general form of our life and the other things be secondary? Why isn't that the case? And Marx has a theory about our socio-economic structure that makes it the case that this is not the way in which we operate. Yeah? So we are living under alienated conditions, and we can't just by virtue of will or preference and opting for it, turn to something else and turn into this kind of aesthetic direction. So that's one thing. So we do live in other conditions. But then even if we realize this kind of aesthetic mode of self-relation, relation to nature, and relation to others, would it be completely harmonious? You're right in terms of the self-relation. The self-relation would be less characterized by a certain mode of subject internal violence or hierarchy. So the rationalistic, the understanding model of reason suggests that the only way in which we can realize our reason, and the Kant of the first and the second critique kind of agrees, by subordinating sensibility to the understanding, by subordinating sensibility to practical reason in a completely hierarchical, one-sided manner, and also in such a manner that striking down sensibility seems to be the necessary element here. Yeah, so there needs to be imposition, needs to be hierarchy here, and so on. And what the aesthetic model suggests rather than this is that this is kind of insufficient and this will never allow us for full rationality, but that we need to find a way in which there can be a reciprocal co-determination of our various faculties. And this is described as a free, harmonious, or unanimous, like einhelliges Spiel. It's not completely without tension, I would say, because otherwise it wouldn't be a play. So there's a way in which they inside these various capacities inside each other, invigorate each other, yeah, there's friction, there's tension, but it is not conflictual in a deep sense. Yeah, so there's this kind of harmony. But in regard to these other relations, the relation to nature and the relation to other human beings, this is not a conflictless relation, as I tried to point it out. So the relation to nature is not such that we are in unity with nature, but rather it's part of this kind of other relation to nature that we acknowledge the indifference that nature has towards us and the way in which nature is really heterogeneous to us. And it's not, I mean, we are sharing the feature of having this generality or this genus character to each other, to us, each. But it's not that we fit into nature in the sense that everything just waited for us and the world builds a harmonious whole. So that's not how I understand the relation to nature. That's also being part of this idea of nature being our inorganic body. We have to deal with the fact that so we are dependent on nature for us to realize ourselves in it, but we have to acknowledge and recognize that it has a logic of its own, that it has its own needs, has its own cycle of reproduction. And if we interfere with them, we run into problems. So it's not a relation of harmony there, I would say. And with regard to social others, the way I described the aesthetic sociability, this kind of aesthetic relation, I wanted to understand this kind of common sense and this common feeling that we share, not as a given, not as a security that I can base myself on and be sure of and say, now I can just, whatever I feel, I can be sure you will feel the same. But quite to the contrary, being dependent on this shared sensibility, I have to engage with your mode of judgment and I have to try to make you see what I see. So I have to engage you and I have to make a claim to community that can always fail, that can always not work out, that can always also, I expose myself also to the experience that I suggest I share something with you, but you can't see it. You just don't share it with me. And that's if I have not just the pleasure of agreeing, if I don't have just the pleasure of finding something agreeable, this strikes down my experience. So if some kind of food tastes well to me and you don't like it, I don't care. It doesn't take away anything of my pleasure. I still like it. I think it's fantastic. If you don't like it, it's your loss. You don't see it. But if I'm talking about a judgment of beauty and you just can't see it, my pleasure in it will be harmed. My pleasure in it will go away, right? Because it being communicable is part of what I mean when I say it's beautiful. And so therefore, it requires of me engaging with you in a way and being vulnerable to your judgment, vulnerable to how you feel things, how you see things. So I don't think that this kind of this sociability that is being part of the aesthetic is one that's harmonious or is based upon a predetermined agreement, but it's based on in 5 Minuten, but based on this kind of reciprocal engagement there. But I totally see how invoking the idea of the aesthetic could give us the idea that this would need to be harmonious. Yeah, so I can see that. But I wanted to stress the aspects in Kant where this is not necessarily the case.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting. So thank you all for participating this time on this second session, and I hope we'll see again soon.
Okay, thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for the discussion. It was really interesting for me.